You're listening ad-free on Amazon Music.
In early July of 2021, 71-year-old Thomas Trizona dragged a large inflatable raft across a sandy beach on the Colorado River. It was just before sunset, and he was sweaty and tired, but happy. It was the last day of a 2-week whitewater rafting trip in the Grand Canyon, and even though he desperately needed a hot shower, Thomas felt invigorated and youthful. Thomas was a retired surgical oncologist, which means he was a doctor who operated on people with cancer. He loved being a doctor and had always been a total workaholic. But after retiring earlier this year, he finally had time for himself. And one of the first things he had done was take this adventurous vacation with his wife, Amy. Whitewater rafting had been as thrilling as he had hoped it would be. They'd floated past Native American ruins and through canyons with cliff walls stretching nearly a mile over their heads. They had seen eagles, condors, and bighorn sheep. Now, on the last night of the trip, Thomas and Amy secured the raft and joined the rest of their tour group around the campfire. Thomas's stomach growled as he watched their guide grill another delicious meal for them. Thomas looked forward to dinner and then one more night of stories around the fire. Tomorrow, it would be time to return home to Springfield, Oregon. But for now, Thomas just gazed up at the setting sun, knowing he'd cherish these memories forever. On July 16th, so a few days after returning home to Oregon, Thomas sat at his dining room table feeling bloated and nauseous. His wife, Amy, had prepared a beautiful dinner, but Thomas only pushed the food around on his plate. He told Amy that his upper abdomen really hurt. He'd started to feel sick shortly after getting home from their rafting trip, and he was now starting to lose weight. And this morning, it seemed like the pain had gotten even worse. It was now coming on in these big waves. Amy suggested that maybe he ate or drank something weird on their trip. Maybe he contracted a parasite. Thomas said he only drank the filtered water, and he didn't have diarrhea, which was a common symptom of parasite infections. And anyways, if he had picked up something on the trip, then Amy would probably have it too. But when he looked at Amy and asked her how she was feeling, she just kind of shook her head and said she didn't feel sick at all. Thomas knew that his wife was probably right, and his pains were no big deal. But as a retired doctor, Thomas couldn't resist diagnosing himself. Just in case it did turn out to be something serious that required him to see his physician, Thomas began keeping a detailed journal to record all of his symptoms. He thought that this journal would help him understand what was causing his pain. Thomas had seen some heart-wrenching cases in his long career as a cancer surgeon, and as he tracked his symptoms over the next few days, he started to get nervous. He wanted to stay open-minded about what was causing his symptoms, but he couldn't help gravitating toward the dreaded disease he knew so well: cancer. Thomas reminded Amy that his mother had died of pancreatic cancer when she was only 74. In his experience, a previously healthy 71-year-old man with persistent abdominal pain and unexplained weight loss could only mean one thing. Until he was proven wrong, Thomas was certain he had cancer too. Thomas picked up his cell phone and called his close friend, Jonathan Gonen. Dr. Gonen was a gastroenterologist, a doctor who specialized in the stomach and intestinal tract. Thomas told his friend that he wanted a CT scan to figure out if he had a tumor in his abdomen. But unfortunately, the earliest appointment Dr. Gonen could get for Thomas was a few weeks away in August. Thomas hung up the phone feeling disappointed. There was nothing he could do except wait. A week later, Thomas stood in front of the bathroom mirror squeezing toothpaste onto his brush. And then he looked up and felt totally alarmed by his reflection. He was pale and gaunt. His weight was now down about 15 pounds since he'd returned from that rafting trip. And now he could barely stand from the fatigue he felt, let alone brush his teeth. Just then, a bout of nausea swept over Thomas, and he rushed to the toilet. He dropped to his knees, preparing to vomit, but nothing came out. All of a sudden, he felt these severe spasms in his stomach as he fell over sideways onto the floor. The tiles were freezing cold against his cheek as he lay there shivering in just his boxers. Then he called out to his wife and said he needed to go to the emergency room right now. Later that afternoon, Thomas sat next to Amy in the emergency room's crowded waiting room. His blood had been drawn by a nurse, and he was waiting for the results. Thomas's phone pinged. He grabbed it and opened a message to find the results of his blood tests. All were normal except for one. He had elevated levels of a type of white blood cell called eosinophils. That, Thomas knew, could indicate three things: an allergy, a parasitic infection, or cancer. Thomas had already decided that he didn't have a parasitic infection, and he didn't think he had an allergy either. So that left only one possibility, the one he most suspected: cancer. Thomas asked the nurse at the reception area if he could speak directly with the doctor about the results. She told him that they had a long list of patients that day with serious problems that required immediate attention. Thomas could wait if he wanted, but it would likely be 4 or 5 hours until a doctor could see him. Thomas considered his options. He was pretty sure he did have cancer, but he knew he likely was not in any sort of immediate danger because of the cancer. And no matter what a doctor would say to him that day, if he waited around to speak to one, it would still take way more testing to determine if he really had cancer or not. So Thomas stood up and told Amy they would just leave. He would deal with his cancer tomorrow. The next day, Thomas sat across the desk from his primary care physician. The doctor looked at the results on his computer as Thomas tried to describe his symptoms. And then at some point, the doctor asked Thomas about his diet and routines. And then after hearing what Thomas had to say, the doctor glanced up from the screen and told Thomas that, you know what, this is probably a dietary issue. And then he suggested Thomas try a grain-free diet. Thomas was stunned. He wanted to be screened for cancer. And now his primary physician was telling Thomas, a cancer specialist, to just try a grain-free diet? It seemed kind of asinine. And so Thomas just stood up and curtly thanked the doctor, and then took back the test results and left the building. 4 days later, Thomas was sitting at his dining room table with his laptop open in front of him when he got the best news he had received in a very long time. The results of the CT scan he'd finally been allowed to take had just come back. And the results were normal. He did not have cancer. Thomas felt an enormous wave of relief, but now he was more puzzled than ever. The pain in his abdomen had not gone away. He had barely eaten in the past 4 days, and he had now lost 22 pounds since he had returned from that rafting trip. And so Thomas was back to trying to figure out what was going on with him himself. And so while sitting at the dining room table, he began scanning through his journal with all of his symptoms he had recorded, while also going on his computer and looking up possible obscure disorders that might fit his symptoms. And as he clicked through these medical sites, he turned his attention to a chronic digestive disease in which white blood cells build up inside of the intestines, causing pain and bowel obstruction. Thomas knew that the condition, called eosinophilic gastroenteritis, was rare, but he was running out of ideas. He was growing desperate to know what was going on with him. He was in agony, both physically and mentally. And even though he was a doctor, he was completely stumped, and this made him feel so helpless. So eventually, Thomas just picked up his phone and called his friend, Dr. Gonen, to see if maybe he could help him again. A week later, Dr. Gonen paced inside of his office. He had just arranged to have Thomas have a tiny camera inserted down into his throat to look around inside of him to see if maybe he had a bowel obstruction. But like all of the other tests Thomas had undergone, this one too came back with normal results. Dr. Gonen was bewildered by his friend's case. He decided to order one more test to get a better look at Thomas's small intestine. The images on this specialized MRI would be much sharper than the CT scan, which would allow doctors to see very small problem spots. Dr. Gonen hoped the added clarity and details of the imaging would finally reveal what was wrong with his friend. The day after the MRI, Thomas went to the radiologist's office to discuss the results. Looking over the images, Thomas was surprised to see a tiny abnormality in his upper left abdomen. This abnormality was about 1 inch long and very, very thin. The radiologist told Thomas that the shiny spot looked more fuzzy on the earlier CT scan, and he thought it was just a buildup of plaque on Thomas's artery wall, which is a common sign of aging. But with the specialized MRI, it made it clear to the radiologist that he'd been wrong. Something strange was going on inside of Thomas's stomach. Then the radiologist had an idea. He was curious to see if this weird spot was stationary or moving around inside of Thomas, and so he offered to do another CT scan right then to find out. Thomas agreed, and they performed the scan immediately. And sure enough, it showed that the weird spot had moved in just a few weeks between one CT scan and the next. But before the two men could decide what to do about this weird moving skinny spot inside of Thomas's stomach, the radiologist noticed something else that required immediate attention. It might explain Thomas's chronic pain too. Thomas leaned in and saw on the image that there was another small spot. The doctor told Thomas that it was a gallstone, a hard mass that was growing in his gallbladder. Thomas and the radiologist stared at each other. Gallstones can cause severe pain and cause serious problems if left untreated. And so Thomas's inflamed gallbladder needed to be removed immediately. On September 13th, Thomas underwent surgery to remove his gallbladder. In the last moments before the anesthesia knocked him out, Thomas prayed that he was about to be rid of the terrible stomach pains he had endured for 2 months. A few hours after the operation was over, Thomas lay in a hospital bed resting with Amy by his side. His surgeon entered the room, walked to Thomas's bedside, and stood there grinning. The surgeon said that he had successfully removed the gallstone and the inflamed gallbladder, but that was actually not what was making Thomas sick after all. The surgeon explained that while he had Thomas's abdomen open, he decided to investigate that tiny, thin spot, the trouble spot, from the MRI scans. And he found something he had never seen before in his entire career, something that totally explained all of Thomas's symptoms: his severe stomach pain, his nausea, his weight loss, and his constant fatigue. The surgeon pulled a small vial from his pocket and held it up for Thomas to see. It contained a small object about the size and shape of a needle. Thomas asked what it was, and the surgeon said he wasn't sure, but it was very sharp, and it was inside of Thomas's intestines. And so no wonder he was in so much pain. From the looks of it, it was almost like Thomas had unintentionally swallowed a needle. Thomas leaned back in his bed, staring at this little thing inside of the vial. He couldn't believe that such a small object had caused so much misery, but he was obviously very relieved that the ordeal was now over. However, he knew he would not be able to rest easy until he figured out what this thing was that he swallowed and how he actually swallowed it. A few days later, Thomas took the object in the vial to a lab for analysis. The analyst found that it was a thin metal wire just under 1 inch long. What's more, they found a carbon pattern on the metal that exactly matched burned barbecue sauce. Thomas thought back to that last night on the Colorado River during the rafting trip and the delicious meal his guide had grilled for the whole group around the fire. That was the last grilled meat he had eaten before he started getting sick. Now everything was clear. The black metal object found in Thomas's intestine was likely a metal bristle from the brush his guide had used to clean the grates of the grill on that magical final evening of their trip. Thomas chuckled. He always knew that he would keep his memory of the Colorado trip for the rest of his life, but he didn't realize that he had also swallowed a little souvenir that would force him to remember. Here is our second story called Into the Woods. On a Saturday morning in June of 2009, a 55-year-old woman named Elizabeth and her husband Ron pulled their RV into a campsite in western Vermont. Elizabeth loved camping and took every chance she could to head for the wild, leaving behind her comfortable suburban life in Connecticut. But as she had gotten older, she had begun to enjoy the comfort of an RV. It was much nicer to sleep in a warm bed at night and not have to deal with the hassle of setting up a tent and then sleeping on the ground. The RV lifestyle was just so simple and so easy. Today, all the couple had to do was park their RV at the campsite, then put on some sunscreen, and then head out for their hike. And so, that's what they did. The dense Vermont forest they were in was beautiful, but Elizabeth had to admit that the conditions today were kind of miserable. The whole area was buzzing with these black flies that were swarming all over Elizabeth's legs and neck, and of course, Elizabeth had forgotten any bug spray. By the time she and Ron had got back to camp, every exposed part of her body was covered in bites, and over the next few hours, those bites turned into welts. Usually, whenever they went camping, Elizabeth and Ron really enjoyed lighting a campfire up at night and sitting out under the stars. But that evening, the black flies were so bad that they just stayed in the camper and played cards. Elizabeth and Ron were in good spirits, though. They'd camped in less than ideal conditions before, from freezing cold to pouring rain, and so they weren't about to let a few bug bites ruin their trip. But by the time Elizabeth changed for bed that night, her arms and legs were an unsightly mess. They didn't hurt, but all the red, swollen welts looked terrible. So she took a few ibuprofen to help with the swelling, and then she climbed into bed. The following day, Elizabeth and Ron got up and packed their bags and they headed home. And even though they had not enjoyed the black flies, they had had an overall nice time and felt energized from their weekend in the fresh mountain air. But for the rest of the week that they were home, Elizabeth battled this terrible on-again, off-again headache, and the welts from all those black fly bites were not going away. Elizabeth spent the following weekend at her niece's house in Long Island, New York. She was excited to catch up and spend some quality time with her family. But the whole time she was there, Elizabeth felt groggy, like she needed a strong cup of coffee. And then when she left and began driving back home, her headache came back full force to the point where it was just this constant, horrible throbbing pain against her temples. When she finally got home, she immediately took some ibuprofen to help with her headache, and then she drank as much water as her stomach would allow. She knew that black fly bites were not toxic, but her body seemed to be taking longer than usual to recover from them. That night, Elizabeth went to sleep early, hoping she'd wake up feeling better. But she didn't. She woke up in a cold sweat, and her stomach churned and her head pounded. She knew right away that she had a fever. Her husband Ron grabbed a thermometer from the bathroom, and sure enough, when he took her temperature, it was 101 degrees Fahrenheit. At this point, Elizabeth was really starting to worry. She'd been sick now for more than a week, and she really didn't know how much longer this was going to last. And next weekend, she and Ron were hoping to go camping again in Vermont. They were going to meet up with Elizabeth's cousin and her cousin's husband. Elizabeth was really looking forward to the trip, but she was worried that her sickness, whatever it was, would force them to cancel. All week, Elizabeth tried to take care of herself. She stayed in bed, drank a lot of water, and ate well to help her body overcome this sickness. And finally, the morning before they were supposed to leave for Vermont, her fever broke. Throughout the day, she got better, and by that evening, she felt well enough to go camping. She was thrilled. For the first time in a week, Elizabeth got a good night's sleep, and the next morning, June 22nd, she and Ron loaded up the RV and headed back to Vermont. When Elizabeth and Ron arrived at the Winhull Brook camping ground, it was absolutely downpouring, which made it difficult to find their campsite and hook up their RV, but luckily, Elizabeth's cousin was already there and could help them get set up. When Elizabeth's cousin made a joke about the great weather they were having, Elizabeth thought about her last camping trip in Vermont and decided that she actually preferred this monsoon over swarms of black flies. Elizabeth invited her cousin and her cousin's husband into their RV, planning to cook some dinner while they waited for the rain to subside. But several hours later, the rain still had not let up, and so Elizabeth's cousin and her husband ran back to their own RV, and Elizabeth and Ron, they climbed into bed and they went to sleep, hoping that when they got up, the weather would clear and they could actually go outside and enjoy the outdoors. But the next morning, when Elizabeth woke up, the rain was not remotely on her mind. Instead, she had this blinding headache, and she also knew immediately that her fever was back. Her skin was itching and her eyes felt red. Her mouth felt gritty, almost like it was covered in little bumps. Elizabeth was annoyed, knowing she was likely going to be sick all day and could not participate in anything they were going to do. Elizabeth rubbed her eyes and slowly made her way to the bathroom to brush her teeth. She debated whether she should just ask Ron to take her home, or if she could tough it out in the RV so he could at least still enjoy the vacation. Once in the bathroom, Elizabeth spit out the toothpaste into the sink, and she noticed her spit was bright pink. and when she rinsed her mouth, she tasted blood. She opened her mouth and stuck her tongue out, and her eyes widened as she realized the bumps that she had felt inside of her mouth were these black blood blisters all along her tongue and on the inside of her cheek. Elizabeth started to feel panic rising in her chest, and so she hurried out of the bathroom and over to her cousin's RV. Luckily, her cousin's husband was actually a doctor, and so he had Elizabeth stand in their kitchenette while he looked around the inside of her mouth with a flashlight. And after a minute, he turned off the light and just shook his head. He said he had never seen a condition like this before, and he urged her to go to the hospital. Within minutes, the RV was packed up and Ron was sitting behind the wheel. Elizabeth needed to use the bathroom before they headed off, but when she urinated, it burned. Now Elizabeth was truly worried. These were not flu symptoms. Elizabeth made her way to the passenger seat up front, sitting beside Ron. By this time, her headache was back and worse than ever. She popped an ibuprofen as they pulled out of the campground, but nothing took the edge off the pain in her head or the itching that had developed all over her body. It took 2 hours of driving down winding country roads to get to the nearest emergency room in Brattleboro, Vermont. To Elizabeth, every single time they hit a bump in the road, it made her nauseous with pain. By the time they arrived, Elizabeth was in pure agony. Ron parked the RV, then walked around to the passenger door to help Elizabeth get out. When she saw him, she smiled at him, but she could see his eyes were full of fear. It wasn't until she herself looked in the rearview mirror and saw her reflection that she understood why. Her face was so swollen that she almost didn't recognize herself. About 5 hours later, Dr. Teresa Fitzharris walked into her office at Brattleboro Memorial Hospital, ready to start her overnight shift. She put her purse under her desk, then went to check on Elizabeth, who was her first patient of the night. When Dr. Fitzharris walked into Elizabeth's hospital room and looked at Elizabeth, the doctor tried to hide her shock. Elizabeth's throat, chest, torso, and entire back were covered in a bumpy red rash. Dr. Fitzharris played it cool, but she'd never seen a rash this bad before. Elizabeth also had a fever of 101.6. Her heartbeat was also elevated, and her eyes were so swollen she could barely see out of them. Dr. Fitzharris sat down next to Elizabeth, and then Elizabeth began to recount the last 2 weeks of sickness and misery and all the symptoms she'd experienced since getting bit by all those black flies. Dr. Fitzharris pulled 2 rubber gloves out of a cardboard box in the storage cupboard. She put them on, then gently ran her hand down Elizabeth's arms and back. And as she did this, she frowned. She was confident that this was actually not the result of black fly bites. But Dr. Fitzharris couldn't think of any other condition that would cause a rash like this. And until she could figure it out, Elizabeth was very likely to continue to get worse. At a minimum, the rash could cause serious, lasting damage to Elizabeth's skin. Her eyes could be damaged as well, and there was no telling what this mystery condition could be doing to the inside of Elizabeth's body. Dr. Fitzharris didn't really know where to start with Elizabeth, so she just ordered some x-rays and blood work, and then went to go check on a few other patients while she waited for those things to happen. A little over an hour later, after Elizabeth had gotten the x-ray and done the blood work, Dr. Fitzharris looked over the results on the computer in her office, and to her surprise, Elizabeth's blood work and her x-rays had come back totally normal, and so Dr. Fitzharris was stumped. So she picked up the phone and called one of her colleagues, Dr. David Albright, the infectious disease doctor who was on call that night. She walked Dr. Albright through Elizabeth's symptoms, and she could hear him scribbling notes down as she spoke. And then after Dr. Fitzharris was done talking, Dr. Albright let out a long sigh. He said that most sudden fevers, like the one Elizabeth had, were caused by viral or bacterial infections, and so the problem now was figuring out which one of those she'd contracted. Because Elizabeth had been spending so much time outdoors, Dr. Albright guessed that she might have an insect-borne illness like Lyme disease or Rocky Mountain spotted fever. Dr. Albright told Dr. Fitzharris that he'd be in the next morning, and he promised to make Elizabeth his first stop. In the meantime, Dr. Fitzharris decided to put Elizabeth on antibiotics just in case she did have an insect-borne illness. If left untreated, conditions like Lyme disease or ehrlichiosis can cause organ failure. The doctor just hoped that she hadn't acted too late. Early the following morning, Elizabeth woke up to the sound of a knock at the door of her hospital room. She squinted through her swollen red eyes and saw the blurry outline of a person walking into the room. He then introduced himself as Dr. Albright and asked if the medicine that Dr. Fitzharris had prescribed was helping at all. Elizabeth groaned and shook her head no. She told Dr. Albright that she could barely see and her rash was more painful than ever, to the point where even a tiny shift in bed was extremely painful. He promised he would do everything he could to help her, and then he said he was very sorry, but he needed Elizabeth right now to sit up straight so he could determine how much her rash had spread. And so Elizabeth tried not to scream as Dr. Albright helped her sit up. Even the slightest touch on her skin was agonizing. As Dr. Albright looked over Elizabeth's body, he could see that the rash had spread, and it did not look like the medicine had helped at all. That meant his suspicion that it might be something like Lyme disease was incorrect. But unfortunately, he didn't really have any idea what else could be making her sick. Elizabeth clenched her teeth as Dr. Albright helped her lie back down. She knew the doctors were doing their best, but the fact that basically nothing had worked so far was still extremely frustrating. She could barely open her eyes and her whole body felt like it was on fire. About an hour later, Dr. Albright reappeared in Elizabeth's doorway. This time, Elizabeth could make out a second figure standing next to Dr. Albright. Dr. Albright explained that he'd brought a colleague with him who was a dermatologist, or a skin doctor, and his name was Dr. Jorge Crespo. Dr. Albright wanted Dr. Crespo to take a closer look at Elizabeth's rash. He hoped that if they could determine what kind of reaction this was, it might inform them what was actually making her sick. Elizabeth braced herself for pain as the doctors once again helped her sit up so Dr. Crespo could look at her. He spent a few moments examining Elizabeth's rash, checking her eyes and the inside of her mouth. Then Elizabeth saw him nod to Dr. Albright, as if to confirm a suspicion. He told Elizabeth that she had a rare but severe kind of allergic reaction called Stevens-Johnson syndrome. Dr. Crespo explained that she'd ingested something that triggered an incredibly violent response from her immune system. Her body was so desperate to get the allergen out of her system, it attacked the deepest layers of her skin, causing the blistering rash that now covered her whole body. Soon, he believed, the top layer of her skin would start peeling off. It would look worse before it felt better, almost like she'd suffered a severe burn. None of what the doctor was saying made any sense to Elizabeth. She assured Dr. Crespo that she hadn't ingested anything unusual over the past 2 weeks. She told him again about the black fly bites and wondered if maybe any of the flies could have been carrying some kind of bacteria or virus or fungus that could have infected her. But Dr. Crespo just shook his head no. What made Stevens-Johnson syndrome very unique was not only the reaction, but the thing that caused it: medicine. For reasons doctors do not fully understand, medicines that normally improve people's health can sometimes trigger this life-threatening allergic reaction in certain patients. In Elizabeth's case, Dr. Crespo was confident that the cause was one of the most common, easy-to-get, over-the-counter medicines on the entire planet: ibuprofen. Elizabeth's jaw dropped. She'd been taking ibuprofen steadily for the last 2 weeks to reduce the swelling from all the black fly bites and to alleviate her headaches. Little did she know, the medicine was causing all of these problems. But something didn't make sense to her. She told Dr. Crespo that she'd been taking ibuprofen for as long as she could remember. If she was allergic to it, then why hadn't this happened before? Why didn't she have a big reaction the first time she took it? Dr. Crespo shrugged. He admitted that he really didn't know why Elizabeth would develop this allergic reaction so late in life. Stevens-Johnson syndrome was so rare that the root cause of it was actually still unknown. But at least Elizabeth knew now that she could not take ibuprofen, and Dr. Crespo assured her that if she stopped taking it, that she would recover in about a week or maybe 2. Elizabeth was given steroids to help reduce her symptoms, and a few weeks later, she had recovered enough to go home, just like Dr. Crespo promised. But because her allergic reaction had gone untreated for 2 weeks, some lasting damage had already been done. Elizabeth's eyes had swelled so badly that her tear ducts were permanently damaged and no longer worked. Ever since, she's had to administer saline drops in her eyes every few minutes to keep them working properly. But Elizabeth likes to look on the bright side and has said at least she can still see. On July 4th, 1989, 24-year-old Patty Stallings stood on the porch of her home in Hillsborough, Missouri, which is the suburb of St. Louis. She and her husband, 27-year-old David, had recently purchased this house, which overlooked Lake Wawanoka. That night, they could actually see the local Independence Day fireworks show right from their front porch. However, instead of looking up at the fireworks, both of them were just admiring their 4-month-old son, Ryan, who cooed as Patty cradled him in her arms. A sense of gratitude washed over Patty as she locked eyes with her husband. She couldn't believe how much her life had changed in just a few short years. As a teenager, she'd lived on the streets, with nothing of her own and no one to protect her. In her early 20s, she had gotten a job at a convenience store, a 7-Eleven, hoping to turn her life around. But things hadn't really changed until 3 years ago, in 1986, when she had met her future husband David, who worked as a professional plate engraver. He and Patty had clicked right away, and they got married in 1988 and were soon able to purchase this dream home, the small lake house with white trim and a nice front porch. Because of her husband, Patty was the happiest she had ever been in her entire life. As the fireworks continued to illuminate the night sky, Patty looked back down at her baby's peaceful face tucked up against her chest. But then, out of nowhere, her baby, Ryan, vomited all over Patty's shirt, way more than how much babies usually spit up. But Patty wasn't too concerned. Ryan had suffered from digestive problems since he was just 2 weeks old, and his doctors had assured her as long as he was gaining weight, he was okay. And Ryan was hitting all of his weight benchmarks, so Patty trusted he would be okay. But still, when Patty went inside to get changed, and also to change the baby, she wanted to make sure Ryan didn't appear sick. He didn't seem fussy or uncomfortable, and he smiled and cooed at her as she changed him into a fresh onesie, and so Patty figured everything must still be fine. So she finished dressing her baby, then she changed her own clothes, and then the pair went back outside to enjoy the rest of the fireworks with David. 5 days later, Patty woke up in her large, sunny bedroom feeling unusually well rested. She rolled over in bed to find the other side was empty. David had already left for work. She checked the clock on her nightstand and saw that it was almost 9 a.m. She'd slept in longer than usual. She listened for the sounds of her son crying for breakfast, but the house was silent. But Patty didn't think much of it. She was actually thankful to have such a nice, quiet, slow morning for once. Patty made her way into the kitchen, she brewed a cup of coffee, and then sat down on the couch. She spent a moment enjoying the peace and quiet, but after a few minutes passed, she started feeling uneasy. It wasn't normal for her baby to sleep this late. And so Patty tiptoed into the nursery, and she found her son lying in his crib, but he wasn't asleep. His eyes were wide open in a glassy stare. His lips were pressed tightly shut, and his chest rose and fell way too fast, like he was having trouble catching his breath. Patty's stomach dropped. She'd never seen her son look so sick before. She lifted his limp body out of the crib, and almost immediately, Ryan began vomiting almost uncontrollably. Patty was so scared she began shaking. Still carrying her baby, she ran into the living room. She grabbed the phone, but she didn't call 911. She lived far from the hospital and knew that waiting for an ambulance would waste time Ryan probably didn't have. She knew it would be faster just to take him to the hospital herself. So she called the St. Louis Children's Hospital and told the operator she was on her way. "10 minutes later, Patty sped down the highway towards St. Louis. She wasn't familiar with the roads, and driving in the city made her nervous. And so as cars honked and swerved around her, she tried to look down at the paper map in her lap to read it, but it was really hard to do that and also drive. As Patty turned around to check her blind spot, she caught a glimpse of Ryan in his car seat. It looked like his chest was barely moving. Afraid her son was just going to stop breathing altogether, Patty turned back around and just began looking out ahead for any highway sign that might just tell her where to go. Right up ahead, she noticed a sign that had a big H on it right near an exit ramp, and Patty knew that meant there had to be a hospital close by. So she flipped on her blinker, she got off the freeway, and followed the hospital signs towards the emergency room. It wasn't until she pulled into the parking lot of that hospital that she realized it was not the St. Louis Children's Hospital that she had called. The sign on the building that she was at said Cardinal Glennon Children's Hospital. But really, it didn't matter to Patty. She was just happy to be somewhere with doctors who could help her son. So she turned off her car, she jumped out, and she opened up the back door, and she reached in, and Ryan's tiny body was just so limp in his car seat. Patty unstrapped him carefully and then picked him up and held him tight to her chest. She could barely hear his shallow breathing as she ran with him inside the emergency room. Once she was inside, Patty rushed to the check-in desk and explained what was going on. A young nurse arrived quickly and ushered her and her son into the pediatric intensive care unit. The nurse then took Ryan out of Patty's arms and brought him into an examination room. Patty followed, feeling totally helpless. As Patty walked into the room, she saw her son was already being hooked up to a nasal cannula, which is like a thin tube with two prongs that are inserted into the nose. When they turned it on, it sent oxygen into Ryan's lungs, helping him breathe. Within moments, Patty could see her son's chest was now rising and falling normally, and she was so relieved. As soon as the ER doctor confirmed that yes, Ryan was stable now, Patty asked a nurse to use the hospital phone. She needed to call her husband. Later that day, Patty and her husband David sat by Ryan's bedside, watching him breathe through the tube attached to his nose. After such a frantic morning and afternoon, Patty was totally exhausted, and David, who had left work early to be there, was also very tired. And so as the anxiety of the day began to fade away, because Ryan was very stable at this point, the parents began to nod off. But before they could fall asleep, an older man in a white coat entered the room. He had graying hair and a round, reddish face. He sat down next to the parents and introduced himself as Dr. Stevens, the hospital's chief of pediatrics. Patty couldn't read the doctor's expression. It was like he'd practiced keeping his face totally neutral, most likely so he could deliver any kind of news, good or bad, with some level of professional distance. Dr. Stevens told the parents that their son, Ryan, seemed like he was going to be okay, but he really wasn't sure what had caused their son's illness. He had ordered some blood tests, but it could take days to run them all, and Ryan needed to stay in the hospital until the results were in. Until then, there was really nothing Patty or David could do, and so Dr. Stevens suggested that they go ahead and actually nod off and try to get some rest. 3 days later, on July 12th, Dr. Stevens strode down the hospital hallway, followed closely by two men wearing black suits. The doctor was totally on edge. In his long career as a pediatrician, he'd seen a lot of shocking things, but nothing like this. Dr. Stevens eventually came to a stop outside of a room where he knew Patty and David were staying. Ryan was not in the room with them. This was a room just for the parents. Dr. Stevens turned around and told the two men in suits to please wait in the hall for a second so that he, the doctor, could go in first and speak to the couple. The two men in suits nodded and stayed put, and Dr. Stevens, he took a deep breath, turned around, and then knocked on the door, but then before waiting for an answer, he just opened it up and went inside. Patty and David were sitting on the bed inside the room, looking tired but also hopeful. Dr. Stevens immediately told them that he had good news. Their baby, Ryan, was going to be okay. Dr. Stevens watched relief wash over both parents, and then Patty asked the doctor, when could they see their son? Dr. Stevens paused. He knew what he was about to say next was going to start a very difficult conversation. He explained that Ryan's diagnosis, while not fatal, was still very serious and deeply concerning. According to lab reports, Ryan had high levels of ethylene glycol in his system, and ethylene glycol was one of the main ingredients in antifreeze. It was extremely toxic if consumed, and there was no way a baby of Ryan's age could ingest antifreeze on his own. He couldn't even crawl yet. Dr. Stevens paused to gauge Patty and David's reaction, looking for any signs of guilt or panic, but their faces were blank with confusion. So Dr. Stevens continued, being very careful to keep his tone detached as he made his meaning crystal clear. There is only one way Ryan could have antifreeze in his system, and that would be if someone deliberately fed it to him. In short, he was telling the parents that their child had been intentionally poisoned, and Patty and David were the main suspects. Dr. Stevens watched the parents closely as they finally registered what he was saying. Their eyes went wide and their mouths fell open. He half expected them to begin protesting, but they actually just didn't say anything at all. They just stood there, stunned. Then Dr. Stevens walked over to the door and rested his hand on the doorknob, and then he told the parents that, given the circumstances, he had contacted both the Missouri Division of Family Services and the police. Then Dr. Stevens opened the door to reveal the two men in suits. They were detectives with the St. Louis Police Department, and they were here to interview Patty and David. The little room fell silent as Dr. Stevens watched Patty and David stand up and follow the two detectives down the hallway towards two rooms where each parent would be interviewed separately. 9 days later, Patty stood at her son's bedside in the Cardinal Glennon Children's Hospital. Ryan smiled up at her with no breathing tubes in the way. He cooed and grabbed at the air. Patty wanted to reach down and pick him up, but she was too anxious. Two nurses stood in the corner of the room like guards, watching her every move. When the detectives had interviewed her the previous week, they'd asked her a lot of invasive questions about her marriage and her baby. They kept repeating that either she or her husband must have poisoned Ryan. The whole thing just felt like some sick joke. Patty insisted she was innocent. She had no idea how her son ended up with antifreeze in his system, but she knew she and David were not to blame. The police did eventually let them go, and they'd spent every night at the hospital since then, but still, every time Patty left her room, she could feel the staff looking at her with intense suspicion. Patty turned and made eye contact with one of the nurses standing in the corner of the room. Patty asked if she could hold her baby. The nurse hesitated and then said, "Yes, you can." Patty reached down, but before she could pick Ryan up, Dr. Stevens came into the room. Patty instinctively pulled her arms back. She'd felt like she'd been caught doing something wrong, even though all she really wanted to do was just hold her baby. Dr. Stevens came over to Ryan's bedside and took a look at him. Patty knew her son had been improving, but she was still kind of surprised when Dr. Stevens said Ryan was healthy enough to leave the hospital. Patty broke into a huge smile at this news. She'd been so confused and anxious, but now her son was healthy again. The police hadn't arrested her and her husband. It sounded like everything was going to be okay. But then she saw the doctor's expression shift. He explained that Ryan was being released from the hospital, but he was not going home with Patty and David. The police investigation was still ongoing, and until they knew more, Dr. Stevens had to release Ryan into the custody of the state. Ryan was going to be placed in foster care. Patty was stunned and heartsick. She'd assumed once Ryan got better, they'd be able to move on. But now she realized this problem was going to be much bigger and go on much longer than she'd anticipated. But more than anything else, she was just worried about some stranger taking her baby home. She had no way of knowing if the foster family would actually take good care of him. Patty wanted to scream, but looking at Dr. Stevens' face, she knew it wouldn't make any difference. So she turned away from the doctor and sat down next to Ryan's hospital bed, saying she wouldn't leave his side until she absolutely had to. 6 weeks later, Patty, David, and David's parents arrived at a state-sponsored childcare facility in St. Louis for a visit with baby Ryan. Ever since they'd left the hospital, Patty and her husband had been attending these meetings every Thursday. Patty was excited to see her son, but she was frustrated that the police investigation still was not over. As long as the police were still looking into Ryan's case, she couldn't bring him home. And so the only time she got with her son were these 1-hour-long meetings just once per week. Ryan's foster parents would drop him off at the childcare facility and then pick him up as soon as Patty and David left. To Patty, the whole situation felt ludicrous and backwards, but at the same time, she would much rather spend just an hour with her son each week than no time at all. Patty, David, and David's parents entered the building, and right away a social worker met them at the door, and she was holding Ryan. Patty's heart leapt when she saw her son. He looked healthy and he smiled as soon as he saw her. Patty reached out and took him from the social worker's arms and carried him down the hallway into a small playroom. The social worker followed the family inside to supervise their visit. For the next hour, Patty, David, and David's parents showered baby Ryan with attention. For Patty, it was bittersweet. They should have been doing these things at their home, not in some facility. When the hour was almost up, David's parents got up to leave. David offered to walk them to their car, and the social worker went along too. They all left the room, and Patty was suddenly alone with her son for the first time in 6 weeks. Suddenly, Ryan began crying. Patty knew he must be hungry, and his foster parents had left a bag for him, so she checked inside of it and found a bottle of formula. She took it out, cradled Ryan in her arms, and began feeding it to him. Patty gazed down at her son, who looked totally content drinking out of his bottle. She held on to hope that she would have him back home soon, and this entire situation would just be over. 3 days after the visit, Patty and David were sitting on their porch looking out across the lake when a police cruiser pulled up in front of their house. 2 officers stepped out, walked up, and announced that they had a warrant. They were there to search their home. Patty could see that her husband was about to protest, but she nudged him, basically saying, "Be quiet, let this happen." At this point, she didn't care what the police did, and the sooner they finished their investigation, the sooner they would realize the parents had done nothing and Ryan could come home. And so while the detectives searched their house, Patty and David just sat together on the porch, not really saying anything. There wasn't anything to say. They both just wanted this to be over. After about an hour, Patty heard the officer's footsteps coming towards the front door. She turned to look at them and saw that they were carrying a large paper bag with the word evidence printed on the front. Before Patty could even say anything, they told her she was under arrest. She stared at them, frozen in shock. Beside her, David stood up out of his chair. He told the officers they can't be serious. But the detectives assured him they were. They said there were a lot of things that Patty and David didn't know. That very morning, Ryan's foster parents had to take him to the Cardinal Glennon Children's Hospital. Once again, he was suffering from symptoms of antifreeze poisoning. When police spoke to his foster parents, they learned that Patty had been left alone with him during their last visit, and she had fed him a bottle of formula. Forensic analysts tested the bottle and found traces of antifreeze inside. Plus, the detectives had just discovered an open gallon-sized jug of antifreeze in Patty and David's basement. Patty was floored. She couldn't even process what they'd said about Ryan's bottle and the antifreeze in their basement. She was just too focused on the fact that her baby was sick again and back at the hospital. The police pulled Patty out of her seat and put handcuffs on her wrists. She heard them say she was being charged with assault with a deadly weapon. As they led her towards the police car, she craned her neck backwards and called out to her husband. She begged him to drive up to the hospital. One of them had to be with their son. "4 days after his wife was arrested, David shifted in his chair in the waiting room of the Cardinal Glennon Children's Hospital. For the past 4 days, he'd been living in his own private hell. He couldn't sleep, he barely ate. He could only think about 2 things: his wife being locked up in a jail cell, and his son sick in the hospital. And in fact, Ryan's condition was much worse this time than it was the last time. This time, he was not getting better, and in fact, the doctors had placed him on life support. A few minutes later, Dr. Stevens walked into the room. The doctor's face, which was usually professional and emotionless, was now drawn. David asked what was going on, and Dr. Stevens couldn't help himself, and he just let out this long sigh. Then the doctor explained that despite everything the hospital had tried, his baby Ryan was not getting better. The poison had damaged his organs beyond repair, and there was no chance he would recover. Dr. Stevens told David that if he was religious, that he should think about contacting a minister to baptize his baby Ryan before it was too late. The little boy was very likely not going to make it. These words hit David like a punch. The grief was so immediately overwhelming that he could physically feel it in his chest. But the worst part was, he still didn't understand how this was even happening. David could barely speak, but he managed to whisper out that his wife really needed to be here. Then David just ran to the waiting room payphone, and after calling the jail where Patty was being held, and then also the local courthouse, David ended up talking to the judge in charge of Patty's case. And David begged the judge to please release his wife so she could at least come to the hospital and be with her child during his final moments. David assumed the judge would have at least some sympathy for their situation, so he was surprised when, without the slightest hesitation, the judge said no. He called Patty a baby killer and refused to let her anywhere near her son. At this point, David's grief turned into rage. He slammed the phone down and crumpled into his chair. In the span of only 2 months, his perfect life had fallen apart. But despite what the police and the judge said, he knew Patty was innocent. She adored their son. There had to be a better explanation for what was going on. David took a deep, shuddering breath and then turned to see Dr. Stevens standing there. In a soft voice, the doctor said they needed David's permission to disconnect Ryan from his life support machine. David asked if there was absolutely anything else they could try, but Dr. Stevens just shook his head and said no. And so, with no other options, David did give his permission. That same afternoon, David went into Ryan's room in the intensive care unit, and he choked back tears as a minister baptized his son. And then at around 5 p.m. on September 7th, 1989, David held Ryan as the doctors turned off his life support. David would sit there cradling his baby until his baby slowly passed away. A few hours later, David had to make one of the most difficult phone calls of his entire life. He had to call Patty in jail to tell her that her son was dead. When Patty heard the news, it was like the whole world just faded away. All she could hear was David's voice, explaining how he'd tried to convince the judge to let her come to the hospital, but he'd refused. David swore he'd done everything he could. He was scraping up money from relatives to hire a good lawyer. He promised he would get her out of jail as soon as he could. And then, for at least a full minute, Patty and David just stayed on the phone, saying nothing to each other. As the white cinder block walls of the jail's call center came back into focus, Patty saw the guard tap his wrist, letting her know her time was up. Patty told David she had to go, and then she hung up the phone and followed the guard out of the room, feeling totally numb. The next morning, Patty awoke to see a gruff-looking police deputy standing right outside the bars of her cell. He was there to give her even more bad news. Because her son had passed away, her charges were now being upgraded. In addition to assault with a deadly weapon, she was now being accused of first-degree murder. Patty grabbed a pillow and put it over her face. She felt like she'd been dragged into an alternate universe. She just couldn't understand how any of this could be real. The following month, in October, Patty sat on a plastic chair inside of the jail doctor's office. Across from her was a young physician who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else in the world right now, and frankly, Patty felt the same way. She told the doctor she'd been feeling overwhelmed. Her hair was falling out, she was gaining weight, and she wasn't menstruating. At first, she just assumed that the stress of this horrible situation she was in was making her physically sick. But now, she was beginning to think it actually might be more than that. The doctor did not seem very sympathetic, but he did run a few tests, including collecting blood and urine samples. And while he waited for test results, she went back to her cell. A few hours later, the doctor came by to deliver the news. It turned out Patty was pregnant. 4 months later, in February of 1990, Patty gripped the sides of her hospital bed, her knuckles turning white from the pain of her latest contraction. When she'd gone into labor, she was transferred from the jail to a nearby emergency room. Patty was in a lot of pain from all the contractions, but mostly she was just feeling frustrated and angry because here she was, giving birth to her second child, and her husband was not even allowed to be there. And also, on top of that, she was grieving the loss of her first child. Patty could hear the labor and delivery nurse instructing her to push, and so Patty dug her fingers into the mattress and squeezed her eyes shut, and she felt like her body was going to rip open, and then suddenly she heard the sound of her baby crying. The nurse lifted up the newborn, and with a smile, she announced that it was a boy. Patty softened her grip on the bed. Still out of breath, she said that she and her husband had already decided on a name. David Jr., or DJ for short. Patty reached out for her child, and the nurse handed the baby over to her, and Patty held her newborn son tight against her chest. But her joy only lasted a few moments, because before long, the nurse gave Patty a very sympathetic expression, and then reached in and grabbed DJ, and then took DJ out of the room. Patty had known this was going to happen. She'd been told that, just like Ryan, DJ would be placed directly into state custody. Now she hadn't just lost one child, she'd lost two. Patty rolled over in her bed, sobbing. 2 weeks after giving birth to DJ, Patty sat in the jail's call center with a phone pressed against her ear. David had called to talk to her, and his voice was tight with concern. He said it was about DJ. Patty didn't think she could handle any more bad news, but she asked her husband, what was wrong, and he said DJ's foster parents had had to take him to the St. Louis Children's Hospital that morning. Doctors said he was going to be okay, but he was extremely sick. At the thought of her youngest son being in the hospital, just like Ryan had been, Patty felt a knot rise in her throat. She asked David what kind of symptoms DJ had and if the doctors had diagnosed him with anything specific. And as David started listing off all of DJ's issues, Patty had an idea. She told her husband she had to go. She needed to call her lawyer before her phone time was up. David had managed to collect enough money from his family to hire an attorney for Patty. Since then, she and this lawyer had been preparing for her upcoming murder trial. And in her experience so far, the lawyer tended to be very busy and somewhat difficult to reach. Patty dialed her attorney's number. The phone rang so long she was worried he wouldn't answer, but finally he did pick up. But he sounded breathless and overwhelmed as usual. Patty knew this lawyer had a lot of cases to deal with, but for now, she really needed him to listen. Patty had a theory that she thought would prove her innocence, that she never gave Ryan antifreeze. The lawyer listened to this theory and then afterwards promised to do whatever he could. Patty thanked him and then hung up the phone. When she stood up, Patty actually felt pretty good. She was actually looking forward to her trial, which was scheduled for early 1991. It would be her chance to prove her innocence, bring DJ home, and put this horrible series of events in the past. About a year later, in early 1991, so January 31st, David sat in a quiet courtroom gallery, anxiously watching as 12 jurors re-entered the room. After 3 days of trial and 10 hours of deliberation, the jurors had finally reached a verdict on whether or not Patty was guilty of murdering her son Ryan. David tried to stay positive, but honestly he did not feel very optimistic. The prosecution had been led by a tall, imposing man named George McElroy. He was the lead prosecutor in Jefferson County, Missouri, and he had presented an overwhelming amount of evidence against Patty. The prosecution's witnesses had testified that antifreeze had been found in Ryan's blood twice. The results were confirmed by 2 different laboratories using 2 different diagnostic methods. Plus, analysts had found traces of ethylene glycol in Ryan's bottle, and also an open container of antifreeze inside of David and Patty's house. All through the trial, David had anxiously waited for Patty's lawyer to present Patty's theory, the one she thought could prove her innocence. The lawyer had tried to make an argument for it, but he didn't call an expert witness to testify. So the judge wouldn't allow it into evidence, and the jury wasn't allowed to consider Patty's theory. David had been furious. It wasn't easy to pay for this lawyer, and now he felt like the lawyer had kind of failed, and Patty's defense had been a total disaster. But there was nothing David could do now. The jurors sat down in the courtroom, and the jury foreman approached a microphone. David tapped his foot anxiously as he saw his wife at the front of the room, standing up, getting ready to hear what this foreperson had to say. Then David heard the foreman's voice through the courthouse speakers. But as the foreman read the verdict, it was like David's brain couldn't process what he was hearing. The jury had found Patty guilty of first-degree murder. After the verdict was read, David saw Patty collapse back into her chair. He couldn't see her face from his seat. All he saw were 2 policemen immediately handcuffing her and leading her out of the courtroom. David dropped his head into his hands, feeling a mixture of fury and despair. No matter what the prosecution had said, David did not have a shred of doubt about his wife's innocence. A week later, David was at home when he received a call from Patty's attorney. He was calling about Patty's sentence. She had just been sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. David was crushed. He hung up the phone and started pacing back and forth across his living room, trying to think of some way he could fix this, but he just couldn't think of anything. 4 months after Patty's trial, in May of 1991, David sat in his living room alone. He looked out the window that faced their front yard, and he remembered that night, almost 2 years ago, when he and his wife were holding Ryan and watching the fireworks. Patty said she couldn't believe how much her life had changed since they had met, and David couldn't believe how much more it had changed since then. Their first child had died, Their second child, DJ, was still living with a foster family, and just like when Ryan was in foster care, David was only allowed to visit DJ once a week for 1 hour. But David still hoped he could find a way to bring his family back together. David picked up the remote and turned on the TV and changed the channel to NBC. In just a few minutes, the program he was waiting for would come on. He had promised himself he would find a way to make things right again. Ever since Patty's verdict, he'd been working to get as much publicity as possible. He'd even convinced the producers of a hugely successful television show to cover Patty's story. And as the clock hit 8 p.m., the opening credits of Unsolved Mysteries, the TV show, began. David saw his wife's face on the television, followed by pictures of baby Ryan. The narrator began their story, and David leaned back in his chair. He'd done everything he could. Now he just had to hope for the best. At the same time this show was playing, across town, a geneticist and pediatrician named Dr. William Sly sat at home in his easy chair watching the same Unsolved Mysteries broadcast. As he saw pictures of baby Ryan and listened to interviews with Patty, the doctor found himself totally hooked into this story. He also thought he might be able to help David and Patty. Dr. Sly was the chairman of St. Louis University's Department of Biochemistry. When he heard Patty explain her theory of why she was innocent on this show, the same theory her lawyer did not present at her trial, Dr. Sly thought it made sense. And if Patty's theory really was true, then Patty really had been wrongly convicted. The next morning, when Dr. Sly arrived at work at his university laboratory, he pulled one of his colleagues aside, Dr. James Shoemaker, to tell him about Patty's theory. But when Dr. Shoemaker heard Patty's name, he stopped in his tracks. He said he'd heard about the case over a year ago, in April of 1990. He also thought Patty's theory sounded viable, so he'd reached out to one of the laboratories that tested Ryan's blood. He'd requested copies of all their lab reports, as well as any samples of Ryan's blood that they still had on hand. Back then, Dr. Shoemaker had done his own analysis, and his results didn't exactly match the ones that one of the laboratories that tested Ryan's blood had come up with. At the time, Dr. Shoemaker didn't know what to do with this information, but he still had all the paperwork in his office. Dr. Sly's heartbeat quickened. He told his colleague he needed to see those lab results right now. The two doctors raced down the hallway to Dr. Shoemaker's office. Dr. Sly anxiously looked on as his colleague rifled through a stack of papers on his desk. Dr. Shoemaker grabbed a few sheets and held them out. Dr. Sly picked up the documents and started scanning through them. And as he compared the original lab results with Dr. Shoemaker's analysis, Dr. Sly's jaw dropped. He asked Dr. Shoemaker for a piece of paper and a pen. He needed to write a letter to the county prosecutor. 4 months later, in September of 1991, County Prosecutor George McElroy stood in front of a huge crowd of reporters and a cameraman. He looked to his right and he saw Patty and David standing beside them. Both of them had totally stoic expressions on their faces. Prosecutor McElroy straightened his jacket nervously. This was the most important and most embarrassing press conference of his career. He leaned close to the microphone and announced that he'd done something unprecedented. He had asked the county circuit judge to dismiss the murder charges against Patty Stallings. He said after reading Dr. Sly's letter and consulting with another independent medical expert, he was finally convinced of Patty's theory. She'd been right all along. Baby Ryan didn't die from antifreeze poisoning. For over 2 years, Patty had been accused of poisoning her son, but she had never hurt him. Nobody had. In reality, Ryan had died from a rare genetic disorder called methylmalonic acidemia, or MMA for short, which caused his own body to produce a deadly chemical that was nearly identical to antifreeze. People with MMA can't fully digest food containing certain proteins and fats, many of which are in breast milk and baby formula. When these nutrients are not properly processed, they break down and turn into poison in the body. This causes vomiting, lethargy, trouble breathing, and organ damage. Patty had told her lawyer that she believed Ryan could have this disorder because his little brother DJ had it too. When DJ had fallen ill, his symptoms were the exact same as Ryan's, but instead of finding antifreeze in his blood, DJ's doctors had found a toxic substance called propionic acid. propionic acid is often a telltale sign of MMA. It's also almost chemically identical to ethylene glycol, which is the poison found in antifreeze. The molecules are only different by a few carbon atoms, and so the two are easily mistaken for each other. When Dr. Sly saw Ryan's case on Unsolved Mysteries and then looked over the baby's lab results, this was the tiny discrepancy he found. The substance that analysts thought was ethylene glycol was actually propionic acid. Tragically, if Ryan had been treated at St. Louis Children's Hospital, where DJ had been correctly diagnosed and Patty was trying to take Ryan when he first got sick, all of this could have been avoided. Instead, the analysts at Cardinal Glennon and the other labs that tested Ryan's blood had unfortunately misidentified this naturally occurring substance as antifreeze, and their incorrect findings had been used to send Patty, an innocent woman, to prison for life. It is worth noting that the mix-up in going to the wrong hospital would not have necessarily saved Ryan, because MMA has an extremely high mortality rate and long-term survival is not very likely. As prosecutor George McElroy stood before the crowd of reporters, he admitted he'd been wrong, and then he personally apologized to Patty and David. He said even though their suffering could not be undone, he would make sure Patty was fully exonerated and she would get to bring her surviving son, DJ, back home. Patty and David filed lawsuits against the Cardinal Glennon Children's Hospital, the diagnostic labs who'd misdiagnosed Ryan, and 3 different physicians. In 1993, they received an out-of-court settlement for an undisclosed amount. Their surviving son, DJ, battled the same genetic disorder that killed his brother, and unfortunately, it took his life too in 2013, when he was just 23 years old.
Kitchen magic, phone buzzing with good news. Throw on my favorite outfit, ready to chase away the blues. La 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 G-Wax, we can do anything. La 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 hand in hand, come and join the flame. La 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 G-Wax, let the music ring. Stepping outside, feeling breezy. Neighbors waving hi, hello. Trees are swaying to the rhythm like they know just where to go. Ooh, life's a melody with a beat so sweet. Ooh, come along with me, feel the dancing feet. La 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 G-Wax, we can do anything. La 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 hand in hand, come and join the flame. La 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 G-Wax.
From Ballen Studios and Wondery, this is Mr. Ballen's Medical Mysteries, hosted by me, Mr. Ballen. A quick note about our stories: we use aliases sometimes because we don't know the names of the real people in the story, and also, in most cases, we can't know exactly what was said, but everything is based on a lot of research. And a reminder, the content in this episode is not intended to be a substitute for professional medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment. This episode was written by Karis Allen Pash Cooper. Our editor is Heather Dundas. Sound design is by Ryan Potesta. Our coordinating producer is Taylor Sniffen, and our managing producer is Sophia Martins. Our senior producer is Alex Benedon. Our associate producers and